There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from watching everyone else seem to arrive somewhere you haven't reached yet. You look around at 30 or 35 or 40, and you see people who have built something, who have found their thing, who seem to move through life with a quiet confidence that suggests they've known all along what they were doing here. And somewhere behind your ribs, in a place you don't usually let yourself look at directly, something tightens. Not jealousy, exactly. Something older than that and more confusing. I've thought about this feeling for a long time because I keep encountering it in conversations, in the questions people send, in the quiet admissions that come out when someone feels safe enough to say what they actually think about their own life. And what strikes me every single time is that the people who carry this feeling the most quietly are often the ones who have the most going on inside. The ones who have thought the longest, read the most, cared the most deeply about getting things right. There was a man I'll call Marcus. He was 42 when I first spoke with him, and by most accounts, his life looked fine. He had a stable job, a small apartment he decorated carefully, a handful of people who genuinely liked him. But when he sat down and actually said the thing he'd been carrying, it came out like this: "I feel like I've been in a waiting room my whole life, and everyone else got called in, and I'm still sitting here holding a number I'm not sure is even valid anymore." That image stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so precise. The waiting room, the number, the door that keeps opening for someone who isn't you. If you've ever felt something close to that, even if you'd never describe it quite that way, I want you to stay with this for a while, because I think what's happening to people like Marcus, and maybe to you, is something much more interesting than falling behind. Here is the part that tends to surprise people when they first hear it. The traits that make someone a late bloomer are almost always the traits that make them unusually thoughtful, unusually careful, and unusually capable of depth. The person who takes longer to commit to a direction does so because they can see further. They notice the trade-offs that the early deciders don't pause long enough to consider. They feel the weight of a wrong choice more acutely, which is why they hesitate, not because they don't care, but because they care more than most people are comfortable admitting. And here is where the paradox starts to surface. The very thing that makes you slow, your sensitivity to complexity, your unwillingness to pretend something is simple when it isn't, is also the thing that, if followed long enough, leads to the kind of understanding that cannot be rushed. But the culture around you doesn't see it that way. The culture sees the timeline, and the timeline says you should have figured this out already. So you take the thing that is actually a form of depth and you begin to treat it as a defect. You look at your own nature, the part that pauses, that reconsiders, that refuses to settle for a version of a life that doesn't feel true, and you decide that this part of you is the problem. I often wonder about the cost of that particular mistake, because there is a cost, and it doesn't stay small. To understand where this starts, you have to go back further than most people expect. Imagine a child who feels things at a volume that seems slightly higher than everyone else around them. They don't know this is unusual, they assume the world is loud for everyone.
But they notice, quite early, that other children seem to recover from things faster, decide things faster, move on faster. And they begin to draw a quiet conclusion. Something about the speed of other people is the correct speed, and something about my speed is a problem. That conclusion doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like the background hum of the air in the room, always there, never directly named. Psychologists who study temperament sometimes describe children like this as having a nervous system that is more finely tuned. Not broken, just calibrated differently, the way a precision instrument picks up signals that a cruder tool would miss entirely. The musician who can hear when a single note is slightly flat, even in a crowd of 40 instruments, isn't suffering from a defect in hearing, but they may experience certain environments as genuinely more overwhelming than people around them do. The child who feels things more deeply is experiencing the world more fully in certain ways, but in a culture that prizes decisiveness and early arrival, that fullness can easily begin to look like slowness. And so the child learns to apologize for it. Not out loud, almost never out loud, but internally, in the small adjustments they make to avoid being the last one to raise their hand, to pretend the answer came more easily than it did, to perform certainty they don't actually feel. If you were that child, your brain has been practicing that performance for a very long time. And right now, what you experience as being behind may actually be the accumulated weight of that practice, the gap between who you actually are and who you taught yourself to look like. That gap shows up in specific ways, and once you start to see them, you see them everywhere. Marcus, for instance, had spent most of his professional life choosing work that was competent but invisible. He was good at many things, genuinely good, the kind of good that other people noticed and quietly relied on. But he never claimed the work as his. He would finish something, hand it over, and step back before anyone could associate him too closely with it. I asked him once why he did that, and he thought about it for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally. "I think I've always assumed that if people looked too closely, they'd figure out that I'm making it up as I go." What Marcus didn't see, what he genuinely could not see from inside that belief, was that nearly everyone is making it up as they go, and that the people who appear most certain are often the ones who stopped examining their certainty long ago. His caution wasn't a sign of inadequacy, it was a sign that he hadn't stopped looking. But it was also keeping him from the one thing he needed most, which was to let himself be visible long enough to find out what actually happened. You might recognize this in yourself, not necessarily in exactly the same form, but in the pattern underneath it. The project you keep refining but never release, because there is always one more thing that could be better, one more edge that could be smoother, and the idea of releasing something imperfect feels less like a disappointment and more like an exposure. The conversation you've rehearsed but never started, where you've run through every possible response the other person might give and prepared for each one, and somehow the preparation itself became a reason to wait. The version of your life that exists in full detail in your mind, the work you'd do, the place you'd live, the person you'd be, but never quite makes contact with the actual world you're standing in. These aren't symptoms of laziness, they are the fingerprints of a mind that learned, very early, that being seen means being evaluated, and that being evaluated before you are ready means something bad happens. Marcus had a habit I recognized immediately when he described it. Every time someone asked him what he was working on, he would minimize it. "Just a little side thing," he'd say, "nothing serious yet," and then change the subject before they could ask a follow-up question. He did this so automatically that he didn't even notice he was doing it until I asked him directly, "What would happen if you told someone what you were actually working on and they said it sounded interesting?" He paused for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "I think I'm afraid that if I claim it and then it doesn't work out, that says something permanent about me." That sentence is worth staying with. The fear isn't failure, it's identification. It's the difference between "this thing didn't work" and "I am someone whose things don't work." And the mind that has learned to be careful will do almost anything to avoid the second sentence, including never finding out whether the first one is even true. The brain remembered that lesson, generalized it, and began to applying it everywhere, even to situations where the original threat no longer existed. And this is where it gets more complicated, because the brain doesn't just apply that lesson passively.
It actively organizes experience around it. Think of it this way. Every time you pull back before something can be judged, every time you finish something and don't show it, or get close to a decision and find a reason to wait, your nervous system records that as a success. The threat was avoided. No bad thing happened, which means do that again next time. Over years, this creates a groove in how you move through life. Not a rut exactly, but a preferred path that your brain returns to automatically, the way water finds the same channel after every rain. The groove isn't painful to be in, that's the thing. It can feel like patience. It can feel like wisdom. It can feel like you are simply being careful when what is actually happening is that the careful feeling has become its own reward, a way of staying near possibility without ever having to find out if the possibility was real. Marcus spent 3 years writing the first chapter of something he had wanted to write for a decade. Not because he wasn't capable, because the chapter staying unfinished meant the book could still be perfect, and a finished, imperfect book felt like a threat his nervous system hadn't learned to tolerate yet. The waiting room, again, still holding the number. Not because the door is locked, but because walking up to it feels more dangerous than sitting still. And what happens over time as this pattern deepens is not dramatic. It is quiet and it is cumulative. The world you actually inhabit begins to get smaller than the world you are capable of. Not all at once, gradually, the way a room gets darker as an afternoon passes, so slowly you don't notice until you realize you're sitting in the dark. The version of you that takes up space shrinks a little. The risks that feel manageable narrow. The relationships where you show up fully become fewer, because full presence requires a kind of visibility that no longer feels safe. The window of what feels possible gets smaller, while the window of what you imagine doing, the life you carry in parallel inside your head, in precise and sometimes painful detail, stays enormous. And that gap between those two things is where most of the pain lives. Not in failure, not in a single devastating moment where everything fell apart, in the sustained, quiet distance between what is and what you know in some part of you that you rarely visit directly, that you are capable of. There is also something else that happens, which is perhaps the most disorienting part of this whole pattern. The longer the gap persists, the more the mind begins to offer an explanation for it. And the explanation it tends to offer is a story about your fundamental nature. Not, I haven't moved toward this thing yet, but I am the kind of person who doesn't move toward things. Not, the timing wasn't right, but I am someone who will never quite find the right time. The behavior, repeated long enough, starts to look like identity, and once something looks like identity, changing it feels like losing yourself rather than finding yourself. This is the quiet cruelty of the groove. It doesn't just limit what you do, it starts to define who you believe you are. And you carry that belief the way you carry a stone in your pocket, everywhere, without thinking about it, so accustomed to its weight that you've stopped noticing it's there. I want to offer you something here that isn't a list of steps, because steps aren't actually the problem. The problem isn't that you don't know what to do. If anything, you probably know too clearly what you would do in an ideal world. You've thought about it in precise and careful detail. The problem is that knowing and doing run on different circuits, and the circuit that governs doing has been quietly rewired over a long time to treat visibility as danger. What changes things isn't more information, it's a different relationship with your own experience, specifically with the feeling that comes right before you would otherwise pull back. That feeling, the tightening, the urge to wait one more week, to revise one more time, to make sure you're really ready. That feeling is not evidence that you're not ready. It is the feeling the brain produces whenever you are about to move outside the groove it has learned to prefer. It is, in the most literal sense, the sensation of growth, which means it cannot be the signal to stop.
Marcus eventually did finish the thing he had been writing. Not because he felt ready, he never felt ready, but because he began to recognize that waiting for readiness was itself the pattern he was trying to change, and that the only way to interrupt a pattern is to do the thing the pattern tells you not to do, even once, even imperfectly. The first chapter he let someone else read was not the best thing he had ever written. He knew that. But what happened after he let someone read it was not what his nervous system had been predicting for 30 years. Nobody decided he was inadequate. The world didn't recalibrate its opinion of him. One person said, "I want to know what happens next." And something that had been wound tight for a very long time came slightly loose. This is the thing about late bloomers that the timeline misses entirely. The arrival is not delayed because something is wrong. The arrival is delayed because something inside is being held to a standard that external timelines know nothing about. The tree that takes 20 years to flower isn't behind the tree that flowers in 5. It is a different tree, with a different architecture, producing something that required that much time to form. The problem was never the waiting. The problem was learning to treat the waiting as proof of a verdict that had never actually been delivered. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not waiting in a room where everyone else has already been called. What is more likely is that you have been carrying a story about yourself that was written in a language you were too young to question, a language that said the speed of others is the correct speed, and any deviation from it is a defect. That story was never true. It was a child's attempt to make sense of a world that moved differently than they did, and it has been shaping your choices quietly and consistently for most of your life. Seeing it doesn't undo it immediately, but seeing it changes the relationship you have with it, and that shift, small as it first appears, is where everything begins. Marcus told me something, months after the first chapter, that I've thought about often since. He said, "I spent so long trying to figure out who I was supposed to be that I forgot to notice who I actually am when I'm not performing." There is a version of you that exists in the absence of the performance, the version that has been here the whole time, waiting not in a waiting room, but in the quiet behind the noise of all that comparison. That version doesn't need to arrive anywhere. It's already here. The only question is whether you are willing to let it be seen, not when it's finished, not when it's ready, not when the conditions are exactly right, but now, as it actually is, in whatever incomplete and genuine form that takes. Because the late bloom is not a late failure. It is a particular kind of becoming, slower than some, definitely deeper than most, and entirely its own. I want to leave you with something to sit with, rather than something to do. When you think about an area of your life where you feel most behind, most aware of the gap between where you are and where you thought you'd be, I want you to ask yourself honestly, is the feeling that you're not ready a reading of reality, or is it the groove? Is the waiting wisdom, or is it the pattern? You don't have to answer that today, but the fact that you're asking it at all means something has already shifted. If any part of what we talked about today felt close to something you've been carrying, I'd love to know what that thing is, if you want to share it below. And if you've ever felt like you found your way into yourself later than expected, and it turned out to matter more than the timeline suggested, that is exactly the kind of story that makes the rest of us feel less alone. There's another conversation I think you might want to have about why some of us spend our whole lives preparing to live instead of actually living, and what it takes to stop. That's the one we're going to have next.